going to be in the Old Testament this morning. Now, Easter season is over, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in between Easter and the ascension of Christ. And in the book of Ezekiel, the 37th chapter, and the pastor's going to read 14 verses, there is this thing about these bones. And the world will tell you that this couldn't physically have happened, that it's a fairy tale, that it's made up. Well, they lied, indeed, because they can't accept the supernatural, and they can't accept that there is a God. There are lots of gods, mostly involving money and sex, but that there is a creator. So we're going to listen to what in the world is a very odd story this morning. Some of you may have never heard of it. Listen closely. Ezekiel 37 and the 14 verses. Pastor Ward?
It will be a delight. I would like to read a verse from Ezekiel 36 before we go into this. In Ezekiel 36, it says here, starting at verse 37, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am ready to hear Israel's prayers and to increase their numbers like a flock. They will be as numerous as the sacred flocks that fill Jerusalem's streets at the time for festivals. The ruined cities will be crowded with people once more, and everyone will know that I am the Lord. Now I'd like to change that with just a couple of words for our modern application. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am ready to hear my people's prayers and to increase their numbers like a flock. They will be as numerous as the sacred flocks that fill my kingdom. The ruined cities like Pontiac will be crowded with people once more, and everyone will know that I am the Lord. And that is the context for what we're going to read about the valley of dry bones. Because here God makes a promise. And in 37, he describes how he fulfills it. In chapter 37, we have the answer that Nicodemus didn't know. When Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, in John chapter 3, Jesus told him, you must be born again. And Nicodemus was floored. And in the conversation, Jesus ends up saying, look, are you a master in Israel and you don't know these things? What things? How is Nicodemus supposed to know you're supposed to be born again? By Jeremiah, who said he would make a new covenant. By what we read in Ezekiel last week, about he would take the heart of stone out of us and give us a heart of flesh, and put his spirit in us and teach us his ways and laws. And now we're going to see another step, a step that is parallel to the new birth and resurrection. Chapter 37. The Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. In Hebrew, the word spirit, wind, and breath are all the same word, ruach. And the context determines how it's used. It would be just as accurate to say, the Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the wind of the Lord to a valley filled with dry bones. Can you imagine a wind powerful enough to pick you up off the ground and carry you away into a far place you've never been before? In this case, a valley. Now, my son Jonathan and I were talking yesterday, and he mentioned that there's a difference between a valley and a ravine. A ravine is just a narrow spot, normally where water runs through. A valley can be miles between mountains. And here, this is a valley, not a ravine. And bones covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then the Lord asked me, Son of man, can these bones become people again? Oh, sovereign Lord, I replied, only you know the answer to that. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Behold, I am going to put breath into you and make you live with skin. I will put breath or spirit in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. And after that, you can see nothing happened. God himself, standing there in that valley, had spoken his words to those bones, and they sat there until Ezekiel spoke what God told him to. God has sovereignly decided that he's going to work through people. So I spoke this message just as he told me. Suddenly, as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached to themselves as complete skeletons. And can you imagine that, standing there watching bones whiz by you, dodging them, watching this whole floor just scatter like somebody put a bunch of Legos in a pan and was just shaking it. And when it was all done, there were skeletons. Then, as I watched, muscle and flesh formed over the bones. Then skin formed to cover their bodies. But they still had no breath in them. Then the Lord said to me, speak a prophetic message to the winds, Son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath, from the four winds, breathe into these dead bodies, that they may live. And again, nothing happened until Ezekiel said what he did. So I spoke the message as he commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet, a great army. Those of you that know weather know that if you have simultaneous winds from the north, south, east, and west, they will form a tornado, a big circle. And what was happening is Ezekiel was standing there with the Lord in this valley, and his clothing was snapping in the wind. And God had his hand on his shoulder so he didn't get carried away with it. But what he saw was he saw these bodies gasp for breath and then stand up. They were alive. Then the Lord said to me, Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, we have become old, dry bones. All hope is gone. Our nation is finished. And we've heard that even today, that all hope is gone. And our nation is finished. But this is what God says. Therefore, prophesy to them and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Oh, my people, I will open your graves of exile. I will cause you to rise again. Then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live again and return home to your land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done what I said. Yes, the Lord has spoken. Bishop.
Praise the Lord. Isn't that a fascinating story? Now we're going to do our responsive reading, which is returning God's word unto him, because he told us to do it, just like he told Ezekiel to speak, so that we can come into unity and the Holy Spirit may move freely among us. And today it's Psalm 102, Psalm 102.
And our response is, He is not here. He is risen.
Now let us stand. Pastor will be read only this morning, Pastor. Book of Acts, and he'll read the first chapter. Acts chapter 1, it's the fifth book in the New Testament, right after the Gospels, written by Luke, the great physician, same one that wrote the Gospel of Luke, also wrote the book of Acts. And Pastor will read the 12 first verses of that chapter.
In the first book, I told you, Theophilus, about everything that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving his chosen apostles further instructions through the Holy Spirit. During the 40 days after his crucifixion, he appeared to the apostles from time to time, was eating with them, he commanded them, "Do not leave Jerusalem until the Father sends you the gift he promised, as I told you before. John baptized with water, but in just a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit." And that's where we get that term, baptism with the Holy Spirit. So when the apostles were with Jesus, they kept on asking, "Lord, has the time come for you to free Israel and to restore our kingdom?" And this is a universal reply to all the church through time. He replied, "The Father alone has the authority to set those days and times, so they're not for you to know. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere. In Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." After saying this, he was taken up into a cloud while they were watching, like Ezekiel was taken up by the Spirit of the Lord, and they could no longer see him. And as they strained to see him rising into heaven, 2 white-robed men suddenly stood among them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why are you standing here staring into heaven? Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, has been taken from you into heaven, but someday he will return from heaven in the same way you saw him go." Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, a distance of about half a mile. And when they arrived, they went to the upstairs room of the house where they were staying. Bishop.
Praise the Lord. You may be seated. David, you would grab your trumpet. I've asked Dave to sing a hymn. I've asked Dave to play a hymn. Put your heart back in your chest, brother. It's an old hymn of the church written by Bill and Gloria Gaither back in the late 60s, called "Because He Lives." David, if you would play this hymn, please. God sent His Son. They called Him Jesus. He came to love, to heal and forgive. He lived and He died. Why? To buy our pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because
grateful to be here in this place where your place, to worship you and honor you. Father, we just pray that you bless the words that you've given to Pastor Layne. Open our ears and our hearts to hear your word. We ask this, Father, in Jesus' precious name.
Amen. Do you know where they're at, man? David, do you know where they're at? Andre, where are they? Sherry? You know where they're at, preacher?
Yes, sir.
Where are the bones of Christ? We can't find them. This morning's sermon, after the tomb. Where are those bones? As you can tell from the scriptures this morning, the topic is bones. We read a lot of bones. I want to read just the first 4 verses of Acts again this morning. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. Now this is Luke writing. And his former book is the Gospel of Luke. Until the day he was taken up to heaven. And who's the he? Jesus. Till he was taken up to heaven after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles that he had chosen. After his suffering, he showed himself to these men and gave many, I want you to hear this line, convincing proofs.
Yes.
It's what scientists always say. There are convincing proofs that he was, what? Alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. Last Easter, the week before we started this congregation, I was at Bishop Antonio Gibson's church. And I was his Easter morning speaker. Now, in all the years I've pastored, I must admit, I have never given up my pulpit on an Easter Sunday morning, because that's the message of the year. But he asked me to come preach at his church, which quite honestly, I always say I'm not surprised much more anymore, but I was. And indeed, I said, why would you give up Easter? Because my people have heard what I know. They need a different voice. Well, in that message, I had talked about something I had read. And it was something about not being surprised if suddenly there was going to be a news report that they have found the bones of Jesus Christ in a grave somewhere. And, as Gomer Pyle would say, what? Surprise, surprise, surprise. About a year later, it's happened. Now, I went back and looked at the tape, and lo and behold, I did say that very thing. Now, I'm not a great prophet, but it doesn't surprise me. Since the day he got out of that grave, the world has been trying through proofs to say it didn't happen.
That's right.
Just as the story about Ezekiel and the dry bones and him speaking them back to life. And I love the way he said the story. Can you imagine being in that tornado? It's terrifying. We have a show, I don't watch it, but many people do, called The Walking Dead. The fascination with zombies is beyond my reasoning, but it's a very popular show. And quite honestly, the few times I've glanced at it, I'm terrified. Why I want to be scared on purpose is I don't get. But that was a real life thing. Now understand that the Jews thought he was coming back to set up an earthly kingdom.
Right.
Get rid of that goofball Nero and take over the world.
Right.
And when that didn't happen and they saw him die, they had to prove he stayed dead. So they had to find out, where are those bones? And why were they so important? Because all their life they'd heard the story in Ezekiel, the valley of the dry bones. Well, it's amazing that whenever we get these little stories about proofs that can try and disprove the resurrection, you notice they're always about a week before Easter? It's amazing how the world does that. Now, in the last few years, it was the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, the Jesus Papers, and then the big one, the Da Vinci Code. Ask the world and they'll tell you it's a true thing. Let me tell you, God allows times when the so-called, quote, evidence, unquote, seems to contradict the Word of God to give us a choice to either believe by faith or accept the world's so-called evidence. Now, the kicker is every time the world comes up with the evidence, what we find out when we dig deeper is that it always gets what? Discredited.
Right.
The so-called evidence is usually made up or looked at in such a convoluted way that no man in the world could go into that bendability. He wants us, Jesus that is, wants us to believe his word.
Amen.
Above all else. Now, on the internet, which can be a great thing or also can be an absolute quagmire of nonsense, there is a thing called JerusalemCNSnews.com. And it claimed in a brand new documentary that an ancient tomb discovered decades ago outside of Jerusalem contained the bones of Jesus and his family. Now, I almost threw up when I read that. This so-called discovery is the greatest money gimmick I've ever seen. But scientifically, it is pure and utter nonsense. Now, some of the times when I preach in this, I'm going to preach about current events. Because this Bible is a great historical book, but that history doesn't do us one shred of good if we can't apply it to our everyday life. So let's talk this morning about these so-called bones of Jesus Christ.
Good.
This is according to the leading archaeologists and scholars of Jerusalem. They were interviewed about this report, and the consensus was utter nonsense. I went, oh good, we got real live scientists and archaeologists on our side, but they still played this thing called The Lost Tomb of Jesus. It aired on the Discovery Channel just March 4th, just a month and a few days ago. They claimed that the 2,000-year-old tomb contained 10 boxes of bones belonging to a family of, and they said, we think Jesus of Nazareth. 2 millennia ago, the dead were left to decompose in caves. And their bones collected a year later, that was their tradition, and then buried in bone boxes or ossuaries.
Right.
That's how they did it. Now we put them in a box and dig a hole. We've not come a long ways, have we? The documentary claimed, I watched this thing, trying to not throw up, that inscriptions on 6 of the 10 ossuaries found in a single tomb indicate there is a, I love this, 1 in 600 chance. 1 in 600 that the bones in the tomb were those of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and a son. Yarr! Along with other family members, the press release said, they got a paper to report this. Now let me tell you something. According to the Bible, Jesus was God incarnate, and he was crucified, rose from the dead, and ascended into heaven. And that's why they can't find his bones.
Amen.
He wasn't married. He didn't have any children except spiritual ones, and that's you and me.
Right.
Amen.
And Mary Magdalene was a woman of whom 7 demons were exorcised out of, and she became a follower of Jesus Christ. But there was no untoward, immoral affair between him and Mary Magdalene. And anybody that says that is a downright dirty, low-down liar. In the old days, I would have used other language, but I've been saying it. A guy named Professor Amos Cloner, he's at the Elon University in Jerusalem. He oversaw the original archaeological dig. When they found this was 27 years ago. but it's just making the news. I find that to be interesting. Now, he dismissed the tale entirely. Says it makes a great story for TV. But what they're saying is completely impossible. It's utter nonsense. Now you ask me, Pastor, why does all this matter? Well, the very fact that Jesus, if he had an ossuary, would contradict our complete total Christian belief that he was resurrected and ascended into heaven. So when people tell us that, we need to be able to defend our faith. In our denomination, our group of fellowship of churches across the country, Pastor Ward is our defender of the faith. He is a scriptural walking Bible. He will say no, he doesn't know near enough. We would argue with him. He'd probably win the argument, but let's look at the problems with the lost tomb of Jesus. One, it wasn't a new discovery, and yet suddenly the week before Easter they got to put it out. It was found 27 years ago. An expert on near archaeology and anthropology, a guy named Willard Deaver, he had worked with Israeli archaeologists for 5 decades. I think that's what this man did for a living. He said specialists have known about the ossuaries for years. The fact that it's been ignored probably ought to tell you something. Now, he's now a professor emeritus at the University of Arizona here in America. His exact comment was, it would be amusing if it didn't mislead so many people. The DNA evidence, you know what it proved? Only that some of the bones in there were not all blood relatives, and 2 of them seemed to be married. That's it. Now let's go about the names. The names Jesus and Mary are some of the most common names of the time.
That's true. Preach it.
Critics said all the names, they weren't commonplace in biblical times, but the Hebrew University archaeologists, which have all the records, and there was a girl there, she said, I love this word, epigraphist.
Yes.
You're the only guy in here that knows what that is. Do you know what that is? You do too, Barbara. I had to look it up. An epigraphist, she said the names found in the tomb were among the 2 most common names of the day.
They were.
It would be like finding a tomb with the name John in our day and age on it in the future and immediately asserting, oh, it must be the tomb of President John F. Kennedy. Because how many Johns do we have in our society? Or in our case, Matt. Also, many women in that era were called Miriam, Hebrew for Mary. And that's why, when we see them, that was why they added descriptive titles to their names, such as I'm Mary from so-and-so. And then, there were real problems translating them to Jesus and Mary. This graphologist, I'm never going to pronounce it right, but she said that she wasn't even sure the name Jesus on the casket was read correctly. He thinks it was more like the name Hanan. Ancient Semitic script is notoriously difficult to decipher, according to the experts themselves.
Preach it, brother.
Nor is there anything remarkable about finding bone boxes inscribed with names of Yeshua, Miriam, or Mary. In other words, it'd be like finding graves that said Linda and John and Matthew. There is common, go to a graveyard and find 1 John, I dare you. Unless there's only 1 grave, there's going to be a few. Now this was especially true in the case since Yeshua was, and 30% of all women in that time, 3 of every 10 were named, guess what? Miriam or Mary. Miriam, which some scholars believe was Mary Magdalene's original name, was as popular as Linda or Michelle, or Jill or Sally in today's culture. Speculating about the bone boxes depicted in this lost tomb of Jesus, simply because of the names they bear, well, it's like finding an artifact with the name Bill and going, hey, it's Bill Clinton! They said there's just nothing there. Then, number 5, Jesus' family was from Galilee. So, what was his family plot doing in Jerusalem? It's like, I'm now here from Pontiac, and you find one in Phoenix, Arizona, and it says Layne. Oh, it must be the Layne from Pontiac? Since Jesus was from Galilee, there's no way he and his relatives had a family tomb in Jerusalem. The tomb in which the Ushers were found belonged to a Jerusalem middle-class family from the first century. Now, all the bones, and this is the real kicker, they were buried when they found them back in the 80s. And only the DNA is what remained, and this is how they based this stuff. The ossuaries no longer contained any bones. The bones were reburied right after the discovery, which is the standard practice of archaeologists in Israel.
That's right.
Now, not even the producers of the show believed it was really Jesus. And yet, they showed it! They did not think the filmmakers truly believed the theory they were promoting, but they said, we're out to make money.
There you go.
And it's a pity people are so easily fooled, but we know they'll buy it! My God. Because people are more ready to believe in fables than in the reality of a living God. Fraser, how sad is that? People will become more skeptical of the true story of Jesus. The filmmakers wanted to stir up a hornet's nest on purpose. He doubted the documentary would affect Christians. Well, it affected me only because it made me angry. As long as they don't succumb to skepticism, it's not the kind of thing that really challenges our faith. For people who really have faith, it shouldn't be an issue. We don't have any physical record of Jesus' existence, he claimed. Why? There's no body because he's not
Here.
there.
He's risen.
He's resurrected. And he is risen. So, what this film purports to show for the first time, they claim, is tangible, physical, archaeological, and forensic evidence. Blip. I don't know how to spell that, so there's just a bunch of letters here. He said to a layman's eye, it seemed pretty darn compelling. That's what's so sad. But I don't think Christians will buy into this. But skeptics in general would like to see anything, something, anything that would poke holes into the story that so many of us hold dear. And here's the funny one. This thing a month ago is now being used as evidence to prove the Da Vinci Code theory. Something they know wasn't real now props up another not real. For millions of readers, the Da Vinci Code was a fantasy, a fiction. Now here is this special, a Judah, a son of Jesus, next to Jesus, and a kid and Miriam. So, the Da Vinci Code now must be true. I tell you that the scripture records many convincing proofs.
Yes.
So, let's look at the scriptural response about the bones. First, we have the ancient convincing proofs. Now, here's the scripture part. I know that I've told you all this modern stuff. 1, the Bible says he was 3 days in that tomb. There is no doubt of his death. Even in the Roman historical books, it is talked about the death of Jesus Christ.
It is.
2, there's evidence of the grave clothes that were all folded up nice and neat, seen by eyewitnesses. 3, he spent 40 days, not 40 hours, 40 days with them after he arose, which leaves, I'm sorry, very little room for doubt. Over 500 people saw him at any given time.
That's right.
Now, I talked last week about the lie. Not 5 people, or 8 to 10, Chuck Colson said, could keep the lie about Watergate. 500 of them all had the same lie and never changed their story throughout their life. They proclaimed his death and resurrection in the same city it happened in.
That's right.
And thousands began to follow.
Yes.
Let me tell you something. if the Jews could have disproved it in any way, my God, they would have.
Yep.
So with the Romans.
And then his disciples did signs and wonders in his name, as same as he did while he was here on earth.
Amen.
His disciples, and this is the big proof, his disciples were willing to be killed for their story. I repeat, they are not only willing, all but one died a martyr's death for their story. Some of them hung upside down, some boiled, some beheaded, some things we don't want to talk about. They were not deceived, nor were they deceivers.
Amen.
Even today, people are still giving their lives for him.
Yes.
I received a monthly letter on the internet from a charity called Home for Christ. I came across this charity many, many years ago. Home for Christ letter this month told of a Muslim man named Bella from the village of Gittin in Ethiopia. Bella and his wife and 8 children, he was a busy man, turned from Islam to Jesus Christ when a missionary visited their village. The leaders from the mosque came to Bella and demanded that he renounce Jesus and return to the mosque. And that happens all over the Arab world. When he refused, they beat him. They came back later and once again demanded, renounce this Jesus. And when he refused, they tied up his wife and stoned her in front of their children. Can you imagine? No. This is this year. When he wouldn't respond, they beat him with knives and clubs and finally slashed his throat and killed his kids, all because he would not renounce Jesus. Now let me tell you the cool part of this. He was a believer for a grand total of 1 week. We got a believer in here for a grand total of 1 week. Imagine, Ashley, suddenly they came in and wanted to kill you. He would rather be dead than turn away from the living Christ that he had found.
Amen.
Then we have what we call moderate convincing proofs. These are the cool ones. I also have a subscription to something called the Jesus Film Club. I ought to share that with you, Linda. It's pretty cool. I wrote to the Jesus Film people a couple of years ago after receiving one of their recent newsletters, and I actually complained, and I don't do this very often, but I said, whatever the ones were in there, I looked at all of them, and they were marginally Christian films. Somewhere Jesus might have been mentioned, but there weren't anything that was any real substance to them. And I realized that they had gone in with this millennial wave. We can have Jesus, but never really talk about him. So I sent this letter. I said, the accounts of the Jesus films I used to get sounded like the book of Acts. Witch doctors being saved, demons being cast out, miracles, etc., etc. But now all I hear is a sanitized version of Christianity lacking any supernatural events. Where did they go? Now, you all know me, know that's the kind of letter I would write. Then, later that day, I was studying a sermon. And I read my own question from an old message, looking at some notes. And my title of the sermon was, what's happening in your church that you can't explain naturally?
Amen.
Can you answer that question first off? I may preach that here, actually. I had to admit that I, too, had suddenly given in to preaching a sanitized version of Jesus Christ. I repented of that, as you know. And all I could think to myself when I saw that, what I had started to do, was, as Sister Michelle went, "Arrgh!" Now, let me teach you just a little bit, and then I'm getting ready to close. Here is my sermon this morning. First, we need a personal experience with Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Because there are no bones.
Amen.
That's right.
His Spirit bears witness within us And you'll look at this when you get home, Romans 8 and 16. There's that great hymn, I spoke to him this morning. There's a song called My Redeemer Lives. I felt his presence. We need the ancient convincing proofs of the Bible, but we also need modern proofs that we experience today. Because we're historical, but we also live in the body in today's society.
Amen.
He still speaks to us. We find this in John chapter 10. Go home and read that. I'm asking you, are you listening this morning? God once told me the color of the carpet of a church I was going to go candidate at. And I felt like he was confirming his leading. Now, I've never had that happen before, and I went, okay, am I making that up or I'm hearing from God? And it was, you'll appreciate this, David. What color do you think it was? Blue. So when I walked in, I'm not looking at the church or the deacons. I'm wanting to know what color is the carpet. Guess what color it was? Blue. I took the church. Here, he still answers prayers. Even today.
Amen.
He doesn't always say yes.
That's true too.
Sometimes he says, oh, that word we hate. What is it?
No.
No, 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 and no. Well, maybe, Lord? No!
You have a lesson to learn. No.
God says, ask me in my name, and I'll do it. Now, this seems silly, but I'm going to tell you a little story. A few years ago, my daughter's laptop was not working well, and so I decided to reformat it and reinstall the Windows XP while I was politely cursing it. As many of us who've dealt with computers have done. All in this room? Yeah, I'm human. I was not a happy camper. They make our lives easier. I think that's a lie. But they supposedly do. So I wiped it, and then the program wouldn't reinstall because there seemed to be damage to the disk. Of course, it told me. I was getting frustrated. Oh, great, I thought. At least before I touched it, it worked somewhat. Now I got nothing. I'm going to have to go get a new computer. Well, God pressed upon me. He says, why don't you pray to me? And I went, what? It's a computer. My word's true. So I said, forgive me, Lord, for my anger. I laid my hand on the laptop and prayed for God to heal the laptop. Now, I know that sounds insane, right?
It works.
Some of you done that. Don't laugh at me. I tried it again, and lo and behold, nope, still damaged. Then I thought, sometimes the old stuff works. I had an older disk from another computer, and miraculously, it worked.
Amen.
I put the other one back in, and suddenly no disk damage.
All of a sudden.
Praise God.
Amen.
According to my daughter, it's still working well even today. Nothing is impossible because Jesus is alive.
Amen.
And he's still in business.
Amen.
I helped build a church in Arizona. Here's another one. Miracles still happen.
Yes.
I tell you the truth, anyone who has faith in me, John 14 and 12, will do what I have been doing. He will do even greater things than these because I'm going to my Father. I was pastoring in Phoenix, and I was a young pastor in my first go-around with the ministry before I got mad at it for a few years. And I had this church that they were trying to build, and boy, you talk about being strapped. They were walking in faith that I didn't understand back then. Now I live in that faith. It's pretty cool, actually. Unless you have that faith, don't come out here, though, because you're going to have a long fall and you'll drown. But I'm getting back and forth, and man, I was making next to nothing. Moths were coming out of his pockets. And I had an Oldsmobile 98 that the church had given me to run back and forth. And I'm running back and forth, and now the little light's flickering. And it's Tuesday. And I'm going, how am I going to make it till Sunday when I can get a check? And that light, on Wednesday now it's no longer flickering. It's going, hi there! You all know that light. We've all seen it.
Check engine.
Well, this one was a fuel light.
Oh.
All right, fuel. And I got to make it back. And I got into my driveway and she was sputtering. And I went, how am I going to get back to the church? Well, I got all it, kept going. But it's sputtering on Saturday night. I laid my hands on that. Lord, I need fuel in here. Somehow or another, whatever it is you got in the deal, make this thing run. I started that thing up. Vroom! I got to church, still don't know how to this day, because I had run probably 125 miles when that red light was on. Got to church, they gave me a little money. I came out the deal, went to turn in the gas station, vroom! There wasn't a drop left. It had a 16.2 gallon tank. I put in 16.2 gallons. Miracles still happen. I say to this day, God's fuel ran that car. Amen. Peter Wagner wrote a book, How to Have a Healing Ministry. I don't know if you have this book, brother.
I've read it, I don't have it.
He tells of Mel Terry, one of the leaders in the Indonesian revival, and he recorded the dead being raised. It's on page 176 if you read it. I happen to own this book, and I was reading through it this week. Terry's small ministry team had been called to a funeral. Now, I did a funeral just 3 weeks ago here in Pontiac. In the village of, I'm going to get this wrong, Anfong, some word that I'm sure I messed up. I pardon that village. And it was to console the grieving family. The man had been dead 2 days in Indonesia, in the heat. He was rapidly decaying.
I'm sure.
In fact, they said you couldn't stand within 100 feet of him for the smell. In the middle of the funeral, God told Terry and his team to stand around the corpse and sing songs until he rose from the dead. Now, I got to tell you, I probably might have a little conversation with God going, what? 2 days, he stinks. God. Well, good thing it wasn't me. Because him and his team, they obeyed him. And on the 6th song, corpse began to move his toes. And by the end of the 8th song, he was awake and smiling.
Amen.
Going, oh my God. The result, this is the one I love. 21,000 people that day came to know Jesus.
Amen.
But why? Because there are no bones! After the tomb, he is still alive.
Amen.
People are still healed in his name. Mark 16, 17 through 20 says, and these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they'll drive out demons.
Yes.
They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands. In my case, David Woodward and Richard and I and Doug Stewart went to Kentucky to see the Ark this year, and then to the Creation Museum. And in the Creation Museum, they have lots of lizards, and they have, 12, 13 foot? What was that thing? Oh yeah, a small snake. He could be from there down. And David has no fear of them. I'm not a lover of snakes. And he takes this thing and he shoves this 12-foot snake in my arm. And all I could do was think of that scripture. And in 23 years, he's never bit anybody. I said, does he know that? Because in the flesh, there was terror in the pastor's eyes. And then my friend, the deacon, that wasn't what I called him that day, snapped a picture. I said, brother, don't post that. Why? I said, I'm standing in Kentucky with a snake, and we're charismatic.
Did he smile at you, Pastor?
We will pick up snakes, and they won't harm us. Well, I know that's true. And when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well. Now, what did the disciples do? Did they say this was all hooey? No! They went out and preached everywhere.
They did.
And the Lord worked with them and confirmed his word. How? By signs that accompanied them. That scripture is still true for the year 2018 on this 8th day of April.
Amen.
How many of you could say God has healed you at one time or another in your life? Absolutely. Even in my own small ministry throughout the years, I've seen cancers disappear, deteriorating discs healed, and pain gone many, many times. I've seen bones in an ear canal, missing from birth, restored. Jesus, my friends, is still in the healing business.
Amen.
Dreams and visions are still coming to the church from Jesus. In book of Acts 2:17, the Bible says, in the last days, I will pour out my Spirit on whom? All people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. I feel like Dr. Martin Luther King this morning. I have a dream! And that's for Pontiac. To find Jesus Christ and to be restored like the city of Jerusalem. Like the temple that was rebuilt. I had a dream before I was ever pastor here at the Cathedral of VALOR in Pontiac. I dreamed that I was going to meet with a minister from a church, and in my dream he was a black man. And he was going to ask me a question. And I thought, what an odd dream, because I didn't know very many black ministers, especially here in Pontiac, Michigan. And then one day I'm sitting at the steakhouse with my associate pastor, trying to figure out how we're going to get this started, making plans for a trip, trying to write out our church theology, going back through the Bible, and having a good steak while we were doing it.
Glory.
Multitasking. And I go to the bathroom, as you normally do, as you've had the 4th cup of iced tea. And coming back, this man who I do not know from Adam, Pastor Antonio Gibson, and he was witnessing, yelled across the crowded restaurant, "Sir, are you a preacher?" A black man asking me a question. Now, I'd already said yes to God's calling, though I certainly tried to give it to that man in front of me. But it confirmed God's call to me, and that dream came rushing towards me. Now let me tell you, lives are still being transformed today by believing on his name. Drunks are going to become good fathers again. Drug addicts are going to become good mothers again. Amen. Prostitutes will leave the street and come running in here where there's healing. Amen. Marriages will be restored. The hopeless will receive hope because Jesus is not in that tomb. He is still alive. He is not here. He is risen. Jesus did amazing things after the tomb, and he wants to do amazing things for you this very morning.
Amen.
So after tomb, where are the bones? They're not here. They're risen. Just
We have heard the joyful